Hello, how was your Chinese New Year? I'm pretty full now. So let's talk about the differences between diffusion and osmosis. Okay, so diffusion is the net movement of particles such as atoms, molecules, and ions. Right, so diffusion can happen. Actually, interesting fact, diffusion can even happen in solids. So if you put like a piece of two metals, like maybe gold and some other reactive metal near to it, some particles of it will actually diffuse onto the other metal. Okay, so there's something cool about diffusion. And then osmosis is the net movement of water molecules. Diffusion is the movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration down a concentration gradient. So this is the definition. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules from a solution of higher water potential to a solution of lower water potential down a water potential gradient. So this also is the definition for osmosis. Okay, now diffusion, a partially permeable membrane is not required, although occasionally you will still see it there. There are a few reasons. One, the question is trying to trick you. Two, the experiment is trying to prove maybe more than one thing, so it could be trying to show you diffusion and osmosis in the same experiment. Or three is just there for something else. Okay, so just know that you don't really need diffusion. For example, I want to say you don't need a partially permeable membrane. For example, when you talk about the example of the spilled perfume, right? There was no membrane around the perfume at all. Okay, whereas osmosis always requires a partially permeable membrane, and this partially permeable membrane must not be damaged, right? It must be working, right? It must be able to prevent the movement of solids out of the membrane or into the membrane. Because if you imagine you have a membrane but you actually tear the membrane or you have a big hole in it, then it's worthless, right? Your membrane is not useful anymore. Okay, now let's look at some real life examples of how we can use osmosis, right, to store food. So humans have been storing food since a long time ago, especially before the invention of refrigeration. So why do we need to store food? Because if we keep food outside, bacteria and even fungi will attack food and make it go bad. Okay, so things like your fruits, your vegetables, they will turn bad after a few days or even a few weeks. So there's actually two ways that you can store your food and keep your food for longer. One is by storing it in very strong salt solutions, right? This is known as brine. This is also known as pickling, right? So if you ever ate like pickled vegetables, pickled cucumbers, pickled what else is pickled? Pickled fish, etc., etc. Right? These are all examples of using salt to preserve food. Right? Why does salt preserve food? Okay, imagine that your bacteria. Okay, so your bacteria is more similar to a plant cell in the sense that there's a cell wall, a cell membrane, everything. So when the bacteria lands on the salted food, then the water potential of the bacteria is much higher than the food. So there'll be a net movement of water molecules out of the bacteria and towards the food. And so this will also kill the bacteria because the bacteria will run out of water and it will die. Okay, same thing happens for using sugar solutions. So things like jam, things like honey, right? Actually, honey is very amazing because honey doesn't spoil. It's one of the rare foods that you can leave out and open for a long time and honey doesn't spoil. Okay, so this is how people have preserved food before fridge was invented. Okay, so if an animal cell is placed into concentrated solution of sugar, which substance will leave the cell and which will move into the cell? Okay. Oh, I see. And what processes are involved? Okay, so think about it. What's your answer? Okay, mainly the main movement is water, right? There's only the movement of water. The sugar is not able to move through the animal cell. Okay, so let's talk about the last thing. This one will be a bit shorter. So what is active transport? So we talk about diffusion, we talk about osmosis. These two processes, they don't need energy, right? They just happen naturally, and because they happen down that concentration gradient or down that water potential gradient, it's like it just happens by itself, Yeah, basically. Okay, so active transport is a bit different. Let's read the learning outcome. We need to define active transport and discuss its importance as an energy-consuming process by which substances are transported against a concentration gradient, as in ion uptake by root hairs and uptake of glucose by cells in the villi. Okay, so there's something different here. We've been saying that substances will move down the gradient, but yet in this case, it's going against a gradient. Okay, why? So living cells are able to absorb certain substances, even though these substances are of higher concentration inside the cells than they are in the external environment. This means that the cells are absorbing substances against a concentration gradient. Such a process requires energy and is called active transport. Okay, let's look at the picture first. Okay, so here is the higher concentration of molecules. For example, glucose. Let's say that a cell already has a high concentration of glucose inside the cell, but yet it's greedy. It still wants more glucose to enter into the cell. So outside of the cell, there's a lower concentration of the glucose molecules. So what is it going to do? This cell is going to do this thing called active transport against a concentration gradient. So it's going to use energy. Energy is released from the mitochondria, right, during the process of respiration. And the cells can use that energy to actually like pull the glucose molecules into the cell, right, through a very special protein, transport protein that's found inside the cell membrane. Okay, I'll show you a video of that later. Okay, and then this will cause the glucose to enter into the cell against its concentration gradient. Okay, and so the cell, of course, then will think of ways and strategies to quickly either move the glucose away from that cell or keep the glucose in the cell without it escaping. Okay, there's different strategies that you can employ. Okay, let's read the definition of active transport. Again, definition, you have to know this. Active transport is the process in which energy is used to move the particles of a substance across a membrane against its concentration gradient. That is, from a region where the particles are of lower concentration to a region where they are of higher concentration. So let's look at the difference between diffusion and active transport. Diffusion is the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, down a concentration gradient. Active transport is the net movement of particles from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration, against a concentration gradient. For diffusion, energy from respiration is not required. For active transport, energy from respiration is required. For diffusion, a cell membrane is not required, whereas for active transport, a cell membrane is required. Okay, and why is the cell membrane required? Because like I said just now, there's certain transport proteins that are found inside the cell membrane. Okay, so where does active transport occur? Active transport occurs only in living cells, because only living cells can respire. It is during respiration that energy is released, and part of this energy is used in active transport. In the human body, examples of active transport include the uptake of glucose by the microvilli of epithelial cells in the small intestine, and from the kidney tubules into the blood capillaries. In plants, root hair cells can take in mineral salts from the soil solution by diffusion or active transport, depending on the concentration of mineral salts in the soil solution. Okay, so what's happening here? Let's look at the root hair first. So this is a root hair cell. Remember that long and narrow protrusion. In the soil, let's say, it has just rained, right? The soil is going to be wet, and there's going to be some salts in the soil over here. So these salts are going to dissolve in water. Okay, now some of the salts will enter naturally, right, by the process of diffusion into the cell, but not a lot. Why is that the case? Because the root hair cell contains cell sap, and cell sap already has a high concentration of salts inside, mineral salts inside. So that means that the initial concentration of salt in the cell is higher than outside of the cell. But yet, mineral salts are very important to the growth of a plant. So the root hair cells want to absorb as much as possible of it. So what it's going to do, it's going to start to absorb mineral salts using active transport. Okay, so let's see if there's a good explanation why. Okay, not yet. Okay, let's watch the video of active transport.
Naturally, molecules and ions move from areas of high concentration to low concentration, down their concentration gradient. But what if you need to move them the other way, from low to high concentration, against their concentration gradient? This requires energy and is called active transport. In active transport, ATP energy and transport proteins are used to pump particles against their concentration gradient, from low to high. Because this is going against the flow, it is like swimming upstream or pumping water uphill, and therefore requires energy to be used. It is easy to remember that active transport requires energy because doing active activities always uses energy. This is important anytime you need to concentrate a substance on one side of a membrane. In our sugar example, for instance, you might need to pull more sugar into the cell, even if the environment has a lower concentration. In this situation, your cell would use active transport. Remember, active transport uses ATP energy and transport proteins to pump particles from low to high. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe,
so let's pause here. So something that I was telling you about was this protein that is found in the cell membrane. Okay, so recall that the cell membrane is made up of lipids. Lipids is a form of fats, and also some proteins. So this is why protein is needed to also help build the cell membrane. It's actually the protein pumps. These are like channels where they can, using energy in the form of ATP. ATP is the body's currency of energy. Right? It's called adenine triphosphate. You don't really have to remember that full name, but basically it's just how the kind of energy that our body uses. Okay, so whenever it wants to pump sugar across the channel, it's gonna use up one ATP. Right? So it keeps doing that, and how then the sugar has to be used inside the cell for some reason, right? For example, one example would be in the small intestinal cells, right? So in the epithelial cells, remember the microvilli or that kind of thing, right? Increase the surface area to volume ratio, that kind of thing. So what happens is that in the small intestine, right, some of the sugars would naturally diffuse through the small intestine, but it will come to a certain stage where there's more sugars inside the small intestine cells than compared to outside. So our body doesn't want to waste the sugars that are outside of the cell, right? Even though there's some sugars in the cell already, it still wants everything. It wants to be greedy, it wants to add all the sugars into the cell. So it will start to absorb whatever remaining sugars are left outside by the use of active transport. Okay, the amount of energy that is used in active transport will not be as much as the amount of energy that can be generated by taking in the sugars. So it's a net positive amount of energy for the cell. Okay, that's why they will do it. But that's why the cell will do it. Okay, so let's look at the summary for this chapter. Okay, now this chapter is called Movement of Substances. There's three key things that we have learned: diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So I feel like I'm repeating this a lot of times, but let's just go one more time. Diffusion is the net movement of atoms, molecules, or ions from a region where they are of higher concentration to a region where they are of lower concentration. It refers to any substance. It could be a gas, liquid, and some rare solids. Just fun fact. Okay, it does not require a partially permeable membrane, although occasionally you will see it in the question. Okay, then what is osmosis? Osmosis is the net movement of water molecules across a partially permeable membrane from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential. Okay, bear in mind this keyword water potential. Don't use this word water potential for diffusion, and don't use the word concentration for osmosis. Okay, these two completely separate. Okay, so for osmosis, it refers only to water, liquid water to be precise, not gaseous water vapor. And it takes place across a partially permeable membrane. It must have a partially permeable membrane. Okay, the similarities for diffusion and osmosis, both of them do not require energy. They both involve the movement of substances down a gradient. And last, active transport is defined as the movement of particles through a cell membrane from a region of their lower concentration to a region of their higher concentration against a concentration gradient using energy from respiration. So it uses energy from respiration. Okay, I've told you about aerobic respiration before, right? That happens in the mitochondria. There's actually another form of respiration called anaerobic respiration, which doesn't use oxygen. It doesn't happen in the mitochondria also. And basically that one, we will learn about it in a few chapters later. Okay, so just to let you know, there's actually two types of respiration now. And it involves the movement of substances against their concentration gradient. It must take place across a partially permeable membrane. Okay, two common places you will see active transport is in the root hair cells and in the intestinal cells. Okay, can you take some time to do the review questions? And then that's it, right? That's it for the chapter. Okay, well done, and I'll see you in school. Bye.